In 1937, an Italian mechanic named Tullio Campagnolo filed a patent for a device that would change cycling forever. It was a derailleur, a small mechanical arm that could shift a bicycle chain across multiple gears using a steel cable pulled by a lever. For the next 7 decades, that basic system was refined, polished, and perfected. By the early 2000s, mechanical shifting from Shimano, Campagnolo, and SRAM had reached a level of precision that was almost magical. A well-tuned drivetrain could shift cleanly under full power, in any weather, with virtually no maintenance. It worked. It always worked. And then, in 2009, Shimano did something that split the cycling world in half. They launched Dura Ace Di2, the first fully electronic shifting system for road bikes. Today, almost every new bike sold above $2,000 uses some form of electronic shifting, and cyclists are still arguing about whether this was the smartest move the industry ever made, or the most overpriced solution to a problem nobody actually had. To understand the story, you have to understand what made mechanical shifting so good in the first place. By the late 2000s, top-tier mechanical group sets had become genuine works of engineering. Shimano Dura Ace 7900, Campagnolo Super Record 11, and SRAM Red 22 were all so refined that even professional mechanics struggled to find ways to improve them. The cables were stainless steel and pre-stretched. The shifters had carbon fiber levers. The derailleurs were precision machined from forged aluminum and titanium. A skilled rider could feel each click, count the gears, and trust the system to deliver. There was, in many ways, nothing left to fix. But the cycling industry has never been comfortable with the phrase, "nothing left to fix." Because when there is nothing left to fix, there is nothing left to sell. And so, in the late 2000s, engineers at Shimano in Osaka began quietly developing something the cycling world had been speculating about for years: a drivetrain controlled by electric motors instead of cables. When Shimano Dura Ace Di2 launched in 2009, the response was split almost immediately. The early adopters loved it. Each shift was instant, identical, and perfectly indexed every time. There was no cable stretch to compensate for. No adjustments needed every few months. The button push at the lever felt the same on day 1 as it did on day 500. Riders described it as the difference between typing on a manual typewriter and typing on a modern laptop. The action was lighter, faster, and more consistent. For long-distance riders with hand fatigue, the difference was genuine. The sport had its first truly new shifting technology in 70 years. But the mechanical purists were not impressed. They pointed out that Di2 required a battery, which meant another thing to charge. They pointed out that the wires had to be routed through the frame, which meant new bikes designed around the system. They pointed out that if the battery died on a remote ride, you were stuck in whatever gear you happened to be in. And they pointed out the price. A complete Dura Ace Di2 build cost nearly twice as much as a mechanical Dura Ace build, and the actual shifting performance, while different, was not necessarily better. The argument might have ended there, but then in 2015, an American component manufacturer changed the conversation entirely. SRAM, the company that had spent decades chasing Shimano and Campagnolo, leapfrogged both of them with a system called ETAP. And ETAP was completely wireless. There were no cables, no wires, no central battery. Each derailleur had its own small lithium battery swappable in seconds. The shift logic was elegant. Right lever shifts to a harder gear, left lever shifts to an easier gear. Both levers shift the front derailleur. That was it. The simplicity of the system surprised everyone. And for a lot of riders, it was the moment electronic shifting stopped feeling like a gimmick and started feeling like the future. Shimano responded with wireless versions of their own. By 2021, Dura Ace Di2 had gone semi-wireless, with the wires reduced to short connections between the derailleurs and a small battery. SRAM expanded ETAP into the mid-range with the SRAM Force AXS and Rival AXS lines. Then, in 2022, Shimano did something that quietly reshaped the entire sport. They released Shimano 105i Di2, a fully electronic version of their most popular consumer group set, and offered it on bikes starting under $3,000. Suddenly, electronic shifting was no longer a luxury, it was the new mainstream. But the price gap is still real, and it deserves an honest look. A complete mechanical Shimano 105 build adds maybe $400 to $500 to a frame. A 105i Di2 build adds closer to $900 to $1,200. Step up to Ultegra Di2 and you are talking about a couple $1,000s added to the build cost. Top-tier Dura Ace Di2 or SRAM Red AXS can push the group set alone past $4,000. For a casual rider doing weekend group rides, that is a serious chunk of money for what is essentially a slightly more refined shifting feel. This is where the battery debate enters the picture. Modern electronic group sets have surprisingly good battery life. A Dura Ace Di2 system can run for around 1,000 miles between charges. SRAM ETAP derailleur batteries last for around 60 hours of riding, and the small button cell batteries in the shifters can last for 2 years. In real-world use, most riders charge their group sets once a month and forget about it. But there are horror stories. Riders who forgot to charge before a long event. Riders who got caught in a multi-day tour without a power outlet. Riders whose battery indicator failed and left them stuck in a single gear on a climb. These stories are rare, but they happen, and they fuel the argument for keeping mechanical shifting alive. However, none of this would matter without one final factor: the prowess. Walk into any team bus at the Tour de France today and you will find essentially zero mechanical shifting bikes. Every UCI World Tour team uses electronic. Some run Shimano Dura Ace Di2. Some run SRAM Red AXS. A few hold out with Campagnolo Super Record EPS. But mechanical group sets at the highest level of professional racing are functionally extinct. And whether or not consumers want to admit it, what the pros use eventually becomes what the consumers want. The aspirational gravity of professional cycling is a real force. The bike under a tour winner becomes the bike on every cyclist's wish list. And right now, every tour winner is on electronic shifting. This is what really divides the cycling community. The argument is not really about cables versus batteries. It is about what cycling is supposed to be. The mechanical purists see a sport with a beautiful, simple, repairable history being slowly replaced by a sport that requires charging cables and software updates. The technology adopters see a sport finally catching up to every other piece of modern engineering and embracing the obvious next step. Both sides are partially right. Both sides are partially missing the point. Because the truth is, electronic shifting is genuinely better in some ways and genuinely worse in others. It shifts faster, more precisely, and more consistently. It allows for cleaner cockpits with fewer cables exposed. It enables advanced features like custom shift mapping and integration with cycling computers. But it also costs more, requires more infrastructure to maintain, and adds a single point of failure that no rider had to worry about for the entire previous century of cycling. So is electronic shifting a scam or genius? It is both, depending on who is doing the asking. For a competitive racer, a long-distance touring rider, or a tech enthusiast, it is genuinely fantastic. For a casual weekend rider on a tight budget, mechanical Shimano 105 still represents one of the best value pieces of cycling equipment ever made. For a vintage purist, the question itself probably feels offensive. The honest answer is that there is room for all of it. What the divide really tells us is that cycling is changing in ways that make some riders feel like the sport they fell in love with is slipping away. That feeling is valid. But the bicycle has always been a machine that evolves. The riders who refused to adopt clipless pedals in the 1990s were riding in toe straps. The riders who refused to adopt index shifting in the 1980s were riding in friction shifters. The riders who refuse to adopt electronic shifting today will eventually be riding in mechanical group sets that are increasingly hard to source. The wheel keeps turning, even when we don't want it to. So pick the system that matches how you ride, not the system that matches how the cycling industry tells you to ride. That is the only honest answer that has ever applied to anything in this sport. Thanks for watching. If you want more honest takes on the technology shaping modern cycling, hit subscribe and stick around.